This lecture is titled The New Movements and the Rights Revolution, and the focus question is, what were the sources and significance of the rights revolution of the late 1960s? The sexual revolution also contributed to the birth of the second wave of feminism in the late 1960s. The civil rights movement had inspired other Americans to express their grievances and claim rights. Many borrowed the militant tactics of blacks and students and adopted their language of power and liberation, rejecting traditional organizations and approaches. Women's suffrage had not ended women's lack of power and opportunity. When the 1960s began, only a few women held political office. Women were still restricted to traditionally female occupations, and major universities limited the number of women admitted. But a new feminist consciousness began to emerge in 1963 with the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Friedan criticized the emptiness of consumer culture and emphasized middle-class discontent. Her book portrayed talented and educated women trapped in a world in which they believed marriage and motherhood were their primary ambitions. Women's lives still revolved around the home, now a suburban home, which Friedan called a, quote, comfortable concentration camp, end quote. The book focused attention on feminist concerns. In 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, barring sex discrimination among those holding the same job. The Civil Rights Act prohibited inequalities based on sex as well as race. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission challenged barriers to women's employment. And in 1966, the National Organization for Women was formed, with Friedan the president, as a civil rights organization to press for equal opportunity in jobs, education, and political participation. A different kind of feminist movement emerged from the civil rights and student movements. Young women who embraced ideologies of equality and freedom and learned political organizing skills once facing inequality and sexual exploitation within these movements formed their own. Some white women in civil rights work drew parallels between the treatment of blacks and the treatment of women. In the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, women protested their subordination and exploitation by male activists. By 1967, women were forming consciousness-raising groups to discuss the cause of their discontent. The movement began sensationally at the Miss America beauty pageant in Atlantic City in 1968, where women threw into a trash can, but did not burn, bras, high-heeled shoes, and copies of Playboy and Cosmopolitan. The women's liberation movement greatly expanded the idea of freedom by insisting that it should be applied to the most personal and intimate parts of life. These feminists, introducing terms like sexism, sexual politics, and the phrase, the personal is political, argued that sexual relations, marriage, and beauty standards were just as political as war, civil rights, and class tensions. They repudiated the sacred nuclear family of the 1950s and permanently changed Americans' definition of freedom. Radical feminists first campaigned for the repeal of state laws that denied women the right to terminate a pregnancy. They defined control over reproduction as the most basic of women's freedoms. But women's liberation's concerns went far beyond sexual freedom. Interests ranged from combating domestic violence to inequalities in the law, churches, workplaces, and family. By 1970, feminist ideas were penetrating mainstream American life. Perhaps the greatest surprise of the 1960s was the movement for gay liberation. Gays and lesbians had formed societies in the 1950s, but these were not protest groups. Homosexuals faced stigmatization as sinful or mentally ill. Most states made homosexual acts illegal, and police harassed gays in major cities like San Francisco and New York. Most gays and lesbians kept their sexuality, quote, in the closet, end quote. The 1960s transformed gay politics. One moment in particular marks the beginning of gay liberation, the 1969 riot caused by a police raid on the Stonewall Inn in New York's Greenwich Village. Instead of complying with police as usual, gays fought back. In a few years, gay pride marches were being held in cities across the country. In the mid-1960s, a new movement emerged among Mexican Americans that challenged their status as second-class citizens. Like Black Power, this movement emphasized pride in the Mexican past and the Chicano culture born in the United States. But unlike the Students for a Democratic Society and Black Power, Latino activism was tied to labor struggles. In 1965, Cesar Chavez, the son of migrant farm workers and a disciple of Martin Luther King Jr., led nonviolent protests to force growers to sign labor contracts with the UFW, or United Farm Workers Union. The UFW campaign mobilized Latinos for civil and economic rights across the Southwest, and by 1970, the major growers had signed contracts with the union. In New York, the Young Lords, modeled on the Black Panthers, held street demonstrations to protest conditions facing Puerto Ricans. Like SDS and SNCC, the Latino movement, with its male leaders and emphasis on machismo, inspired protests by women who called for freedom and equality for all members of La Raza, the race or the people. Indian militancy also emerged in the 1960s. Although the Truman and Eisenhower administrations had tried to dismantle reservations and integrate Indians into mainstream American life, many Indian leaders protested, and government efforts were abandoned by President Kennedy. President Johnson's programs gave some funds to reservations, but Indian activists compared the reservations to underdeveloped nations, and they demanded not just economic aid but self-determination. The American Indian Movement, founded in 1968, staged protests demanding greater tribal sovereignty and economic resources guaranteed in treaties. In 1969, Indians took over Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, claiming it had been illegally seized from the original inhabitants. The protests, lasting until 1971, inspired the Red Power movement. In the 1970s and 1980s, many Indian tribes won more control over education and economic development on reservations, and Indian activists brought land claims and other suits demanding compensation for past dispossession. As a result of a rising sense of self-respect, the number of Americans identifying as Indians doubled between 1970 and 1990. The environmental movement challenged foundations of American life, including assumptions that progress meant endless growth in consumption and the faith that science, technology, and economic growth improved social welfare. The progressive era saw the beginnings of conservation and public parks, but the new environmental movement was militant, demanding that individuals have control over decisions that affect them. The affluence and mass consumption of the 1950s and early 1960s was now identified as the source of environmental degradation. In 1962, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring exposed to millions of Americans the effects of DDT, an insecticide used by homeowners and farmers against mosquitoes and other insects. Carson showed how DDT killed birds and animals and sickened humans. Chemical and pesticide companies tried to discredit her as a communist or hysterical, but her work inspired the modern environmental movement. The membership of the Sierra Club, founded in the 1890s to preserve forests, skyrocketed, and soon groups across the country were exposing the dangers of water contamination, air pollution, and extinct species. Nearly every state quickly banned DDT. In 1969, a major oil spill on the California coast revealed the costs and risks of oil drilling and transportation. Despite opposition from business groups which saw environmentalism as an infringement on property rights, the movement enjoyed broad support. Under President Nixon, Congress passed a series of measures to protect the environment, including the Clean Air, Clean Water, and Endangered Species Acts. In April 1970, the first Earth Day drew the participation of 20 million people. The consumer movement, a close cousin to environmentalism, also flourished, inspired by Ralph Nader, whose book Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965 showed how auto manufacturers produced highly dangerous vehicles. General Motors hired private investigators to try to discredit him, and when their efforts were exposed, GM paid Nader a large settlement, which he used to fund investigations of other dangerous consumer products and false advertising. Nader's work laid the foundation for numerous state and federal laws for consumer safety, which limited one kind of freedom, especially private property rights, in the name of a greater good. Although the rights revolution began in the streets, it won constitutional legitimacy in the Supreme Court, traditionally the most conservative branch of government. Guided by Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court greatly expanded the rights of all Americans and placed them beyond the reach of legislative and local majorities. The court's move toward protecting civil liberties and rights began in the 1930s, but was signaled in 1957 when the court started to check McCarthyism by overturning the convictions of individuals who had advocated overthrowing the government, had not answered the questions of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or had refused to state their political beliefs to state officials beginning on June 17th or Red Monday. By 1969, the court had affirmed the right to hold unpopular views and dismantled the Cold War loyalty security system. In the 1950s and 1960s, civil liberties became integrated with civil rights. The court protected the rights of private organizations to keep secret their membership lists and secured modern freedom of the press. In the 1960s, the court continued to strike down numerous state segregation laws. In Loving v. Virginia in 1967, the court declared unconstitutional state laws that prohibited interracial marriage. The court in 1968 made illegal racial discrimination in the rental or sale of housing. The court also pressed states to respect civil liberties enshrined in the Bill of Rights. It required states to abide by protections against illegal search and seizure, honor defendants' rights to a speedy trial, prohibit cruel and unusual punishments, and secure the right of poor defendants to receive publicly supported counsel. Miranda v. Arizona in 1966 was one of the most important of these decisions, in which individuals were supposed to be made aware of their rights on arrest, including their right to remain silent and confer with a lawyer before answering any questions. This is where we get the term the Miranda rights, which are required to be read to each individual upon their arrest. The court also ruled to oversee fairness of the democratic process at the state and local level by establishing the principle that districts electing members of state legislatures must be equal in population. That was decided in Baker v. Carr in 1962. And they also moved to solidify the wall between church and state by decreeing that prayers and Bible readings in public schools were unconstitutional in Engel v. Vitale, 1961. The Warren Court also outlined entirely new rights in response to changes in American society. Most dramatically, it invented a constitutional right to privacy in Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965, overturning a state law banning the use of contraceptives. Although the Constitution nowhere articulates a right to privacy, Justice William O. Douglas, the author of the decision, asserted that privacy was the basis of all other freedoms, and that a constitutionally protected area of privacy within marriage could be inferred from the penumbras or shadows of the Bill of Rights. The court soon made privacy a right of individuals, within or outside marriage, by ensuring access to birth control, and most controversially, by creating a constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy in Roe v. Wade of 1973, a major victory of the feminist movement and the source of major opposition to this day. The rulings that followed Griswold and Roe seem to accept the view that families were collections of individuals rather than a unit with a single authority. Women gained multiple rights within the family, including protection against rape and assault by husbands.